Hello, and welcome to the Tavern Chat Podcast. I am your host, Derek Tenkar, your bartender in the OSR, your main proprietor at the Tenkar's Tavern blog, Discord server, Mimi group, Facebook group, Twittering, and Instagram thing. I still don't really understand Instagram wholly, but whatever. Today's July 5th. We didn't get burned down July 4th. Hip hip hooray! Hip hip hooray! Hip hip hooray! So, someone took exception with my episode the other day where I was talking about separating the work from the man or the woman, the person that created it. And I used HP Lovecraft as an example and stated that his racism was a product of the time. Somebody took exception to that. So I'm going to give them airtime. I'm going to read what they sent me, and I'm going to respond. Now, my response is going to include some personal observations, and you may or may not find them to be accurate from your point of view, but we'll go with that. Hi, Eric. Just wanted to address something in your podcast. You were talking about H.P. Lovecraft's racism being a product of their time. Untrue. This is a very damning thing that goes around as a justification, and is simply not true. Even back in Benjamin Franklin's time, he begged the newly formed U.S. to outlaw slavery. Many of the revolutionaries were doing it to end slavery, and that means that even the slaveholders and racist people of the 18th century were confronted with what they were doing as immoral, and they chose to do it anyway. They weren't products of their time, they were willing and knowing participants. I ask you to please not continue to propagate this meme. You have listeners and a responsibility to be accurate. Be well. See. Oh, and don't take it the wrong way. I know you're a good person, and we all aren't perfect. All right. So, slavery came to an end because of the Civil War. So let's say if 1776 was our independence, it took 90 years for the U.S. to fully address slavery in the South, right? The whole 3/5 compromise and all that stuff. People in the South did not see what they were doing as being immoral. Now, as a Northerner, in the 21st century, I would find it to be immoral, certainly. But in their time, they thought they were just. Now, H.P. Lovecraft, writing in the 20s and 30s, right? So in the 20s and 30s, we had the South was still segregated. Our military was segregated until after World War II. So American society was still dealing, in a lot of ways, with the aftermath of slavery. I certainly don't find separate but equal to be equal, but I guess that was a justification up until the 60s, correct? Now, personal observations. My great-grandmother, my grandmother from the old country, Chimney. When my mother was growing up in the 50s, she had a friend that was Sicilian. And when my grandmother saw my mother, well, my great-grandmother, my mother's grandmother, saw my mother with this girl who was Sicilian, she told her afterwards, you should not be hanging with that person. She looks black. That was not my great-grandmother doing something that she thought was immoral. She thought she was doing something that was correct. Now, my perspective obviously is totally different. And my mother's perspective was different. My mother was like, you know what, Grandma, thank you very much for your advice. Okay. And then continued to hang out with her friend because her friend was her friend. My parents, products of the 50s and the 60s, because they were born in the 40s, didn't bat an eye, realized they raised me the right way. When in my 20s, before I was a cop, I was seriously dating a girl that was Jamaican and Filipino. My son's mother happened to be Puerto Rican, medium dark skin. This stuff doesn't matter to me. Your skin complexion has never mattered to me. Doesn't matter
because I don't have any complexion.
I happen to marry a woman, in the case of Rach, who has albinism. As she put it, she's colorless. So in a way, I guess I am colorblind. However, people in the 20s, whether if you were what we would certainly call now being racist, right? The vast majority of people who weren't like thinkers ignored it. Okay? So society ignored it. Down south, separate but equal, that wasn't challenged until later. Yes, it was a product of the time. It was socially acceptable. You would not, I certainly would not want to be anywhere near anybody who harbored racist thoughts these days, because it is against my moral compass. In the 20s, I think the moral compasses were less stringent when it came to what was politically, socially, morally acceptable. We tend to think, this is going to be where I stray into game-related stuff here. We tend to think that morals are rigid, okay? But then they might be for the individual, right? But I've always found it interesting. This is probably going from a Dragon magazine, probably from the 80s. I couldn't tell you what it was. Maybe my listeners will remember this article. And it was how two lawful good churches could go to war because they both saw themselves as lawful good, but the other church is heresy. And because the other church is heresy, protection from evil, protect against the other church, even if they were worshiping the same God, but possibly different aspects because it's all fucked up, right? Morals change over the years. They do. It's a progressive society. It's one of those forces that just simply, you're not going to stop. And where we are now as a society is going to progress further in leaps and stutters, but it will progress forward. And we're going to look back at, our moral compass from the 60s and the 80s when we're in 2030 and go, well, why is it that back in the 2020s the Catholic Church did not allow female priests? We're enlightened in the 2090s. We've had female priests now for the last 40 years. What? It's going to change. But just because I have a moral standard today doesn't mean that same moral standard would have applied to the average person in 1920 or 1820. You're a product of your upbringing. A lot of it. And I consider myself very blessed. I have two very, great parents that gave me a very strong moral compass. I don't know if my moral compass would have been the same back in the 20s. I don't know. I'm not a product of that time. But I'm a product of my parents, and God bless them. All right, folks, that's probably more political than I normally get, but I just thought I had to come out here and say it. And I still believe you should separate the art from the artist. Okay? Just because I happen to like somebody doesn't mean that their art is going to be good. And just because I think I wouldn't piss on somebody if they were on fire doesn't mean their art isn't good. You separate the two. Folks, my normal COVID-19 pandemic reminder, wash your hands 20 seconds, soap and water or Skell gel, maintain that 6 feet social distance, wear a mask covering deal shite, use your common sense. Use your common sense, folks. Please. Alright? Be safe, be well, God bless, roll those dice, and yes, you can have different opinions than me. As long as we can discuss it, it means that we're in good shape. Okay, so I appreciate everybody's thoughts on all the matters that we talk about. I talk about. You can feel free to leave me messages or email me or message me on Facebook. I will address it one way or another. All right, folks. Laters. Be good.